Not just ghosts, the terrify. The Appalachian Mountains have always carried an air of mystery. The dense forests, winding trails, and deep valleys seem like the perfect setting for ghost stories and old legends. For generations, locals have told tales of strange lights in the sky, shadowy figures that wander the woods, and entire villages that simply faded away. But most people never paid too much attention. After all, the Appalachians are full of old mining towns and settlements that were left behind when work ran dry. But this story begins with one particular town, a place forgotten by maps and abandoned by time. It sat deep in the mountains, far from any main road. From above, it looked like a scar on the forest. A clearing of broken rooftops, leaning telephone poles, and rusted cars slowly sinking into the soil. Soldiers were told to head there for what sounded like a routine mission: investigate reports of suspicious activity, secure the location, and report back. They expected it to be nothing more than a simple scouting job. But when they arrived, they realized there was nothing simple about the town at all. The first thing they noticed was the silence. The Appalachians are never truly quiet. Even in the stillness of night, you hear insects buzzing, frogs croaking, or wind brushing through the trees. But as soon as the squad set foot past the last tree line and into the open streets, it was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Their boots crunched on gravel, and that sound alone seemed too loud, echoing off the hollow houses around them. The town looked like it had been abandoned in a rush. One of the soldiers, a young private, peeked through the window of the first house they came across. Inside, there were dishes still sitting on the table, a chair knocked over, and a child's toy resting in the corner, as if it had been dropped mid-play. Dust coated everything, but there was no sign of vandalism, no broken glass, no graffiti. It was as though families had simply vanished into thin air. Further down the street, they found a small diner. The neon sign out front had long since died, but the letters were still visible. Joe's Grill. The door creaked open when pushed, and the smell of old wood and rust greeted them. Inside, plates and coffee mugs sat on the counters. Menus were still pinned to the wall. One of the soldiers muttered that it felt like walking into a time capsule, a place where life had stopped without warning. Everywhere they looked, there were details that didn't make sense. Cars were parked along the road with their doors shut, but the keys were missing. Power lines sagged but weren't cut. Even the local church still had hymn books neatly placed on the pews, untouched by looters or scavengers. The soldiers had all been to abandoned towns before, but none looked like this. Most ghost towns are stripped clean, either by locals salvaging wood and metal, or by the slow decay of weather. But here the town had resisted decay almost as if it was being preserved by something unseen. The squad leader ordered the men to spread out and check the area. They moved cautiously, their radios crackling with updates as each team searched different buildings. But the more they searched, the more uneasy they felt. There were no signs of struggle, no bodies, no clues that explained why hundreds of people would leave so suddenly. It was like the entire population had simply walked out one night and never returned. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, and the shadows stretched across the streets. That's when one of the soldiers, standing near the old schoolhouse, noticed something strange. The swings on the playground were moving back and forth, as if someone had just been sitting on them. There was no wind that evening. No explanation for why they swayed so steadily. He called it out to the others, but by the time they arrived, the swings had slowed to a stop. Inside the school, the chalkboard still had half-written lessons across it. Math problems, spelling words, and a date that didn't match the year they expected. It was several decades old, but the chalk was bright and clear, not faded like it should have been. One of the men reached out and touched it, only to smudge the fresh white lines as if the teacher had just written them moments ago. The squad regrouped in the center of town, standing near the remains of the general store. The leader asked for reports, and everyone admitted the same thing. The place didn't feel right, not in the way ghost stories normally make people uneasy, but in a heavier, unnatural way. It was as if the air itself carried a weight, pressing down on their shoulders. They could feel eyes on them, though no one was there. One soldier suggested they mark the location and leave. "It's just another abandoned town," he said, trying to hide the nervous shake in his voice. But the squad leader shook his head. Their orders were clear: stay until morning and gather evidence of whatever was happening there. If the reports of strange activity were real, it was their job to confirm it. So they set up camp inside the diner, dragging tables together to form a barrier at the front windows. The air inside was thick with dust, and the flickering of their flashlights cast long, unsettling shadows on the walls. They ate quietly, their usual chatter gone. Each of them felt it, the sense that something was wrong with the town, something more than just emptiness. As night began to fall, the town revealed an even darker side of itself. From the diner windows, they could see the main road vanishing into blackness. Street lamps, long broken, stood like watchmen against the shadows. The forest loomed in the distance, silent as ever. And though none of the men wanted to admit it out loud, they all had the same thought: maybe this town hadn't been abandoned by accident. Maybe the people here had left for a reason the squad was about to discover. The soldiers tried to shake off the fear, convincing themselves it was all in their heads. But deep down, they knew something was watching them. Something had been left behind in that ghost town, and it wasn't ready to be forgotten. The first night in the abandoned Appalachian town began with tension and unease. The soldiers had settled inside the diner, using it as their base of operations, but the silence outside pressed in from every direction. No one spoke much. They were all trained for combat, for hostile encounters in war zones. But this was different. There were no enemy soldiers to fight, no gunfire to respond to, no clear mission target. Instead, they were surrounded by a town that felt frozen in time, where every building, every street seemed to carry a secret that refused to be revealed. They tried to keep themselves busy. Some checked their weapons repeatedly. Others stared out the diner's windows into the dark streets, waiting for movement. The squad leader wrote notes in his journal, documenting their findings so far. He described the untouched homes, the strange details like the fresh chalk on the school's blackboard, and the eerie sense of being watched. He didn't write about the fear growing in their stomachs, though. That part was unspoken, shared only in the glances the men gave one another when the silence stretched too long. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped sharply. Their breath began to fog in the cold air. One of the soldiers muttered that it shouldn't be this cold for the season, not in this part of the mountains. But no one replied. They all felt it, the unnatural chill that clung to the town like a heavy blanket. Around midnight, the first strange sound reached them. It was faint at first, almost like the creaking of wood. The soldiers turned off their radios and froze, straining their ears. The sound grew louder, echoing from the direction of the main road. It wasn't wood at all. It was footsteps. Slow, steady, deliberate. One soldier gripped his rifle tighter, his knuckles turning pale. "Could be an animal," he whispered, though even he didn't believe it. The steps were too measured, too human. They echoed across the empty street, stopping just outside the diner. Then silence. No movement, no retreating sounds, just silence so thick it made their ears ring. The squad leader gave hand signals, ordering two men to peek through the diner's boarded windows. Carefully, they lifted the edge of a curtain and scanned the darkness. At first, they saw nothing, just the outlines of broken street lamps and houses. But then, one of them stiffened. His breath caught in his throat. In the middle of the road stood a figure. It wasn't clear. The darkness swallowed most of it, but it was tall, thin, and still. Its arms hung unnaturally long at its sides. No face could be seen, only a pale blur where a head should be. The soldier blinked, and in that second, the figure was gone. Both men pulled back instantly, their voices shaky as they described what they saw. The others didn't argue. Even without seeing it, they could feel that something was there watching them from the dark. The leader ordered everyone to stay inside and keep their lights off. They waited, holding their breath, listening for more footsteps. Hours crawled by. Some men dozed lightly, jerking awake at the smallest sound. Others sat with their backs against the wall, rifles ready, eyes locked on the door. But the strange footsteps did not return. The town outside remained deathly quiet, as if holding its secrets until morning. When dawn finally came, a heavy mist rolled through the streets, covering the town in a gray shroud. The soldiers stepped outside cautiously, their boots crunching on the damp ground. The air smelled of wet earth and something else they couldn't place. A faint metallic tang that lingered on their tongues. They began exploring more of the town in daylight. The mist limited their vision, making the buildings loom like dark shapes rising from the fog. They moved in pairs, checking doorways and peering into windows. Every house told the same story. Lives interrupted mid-motion, half-finished meals on tables, clothes laid out neatly on beds, radios and clocks still in place as if frozen on the day they were last used. But then came the discoveries that didn't make sense. In one home, a soldier found a table set for dinner with plates of food that looked far too preserved. The bread wasn't molded, the meat wasn't rotten. It was cold, yes, but not decayed, as if time itself had stopped inside that room. He stepped back quickly, refusing to touch it, his voice cracking as he reported it to the others. Another soldier, searching a two-story house, found photographs still hanging on the walls. Families smiled in the faded pictures, their eyes bright, their clothes old-fashioned. But when he looked closer, he swore some of the faces were blurred, as though the people in them had been erased. He rubbed the glass frames with his sleeve, thinking it was dust or damage, but the blurring remained. It wasn't natural. It was as if the pictures themselves didn't want to be understood. The squad regrouped at the town square where a cracked fountain stood dry. The leader noted all the odd details, but even he was at a loss for explanation. It wasn't just abandonment anymore. Something had happened here that defied logic. Something that kept the town locked in a strange limbo, neither alive nor dead. As they discussed their findings, one of the soldiers noticed fresh tracks in the mud near the fountain. They were small, like children's footprints, but they led in circles with no beginning and no end. The squad stared at them uneasily. There hadn't been children in this place for decades. Their radios crackled suddenly, breaking the tension. A static filled the air, then a faint voice came through. It wasn't one of their men. It was distant, garbled, repeating the same phrase over and over. None of them could make out the words clearly, but the tone was pleading, almost desperate. They tried to trace the signal, but it vanished as quickly as it had come. The soldiers knew then that they were no longer just dealing with an abandoned town. There was something active here, something present that didn't want them uncovering the truth. But duty kept them from leaving. They pressed on, exploring deeper into the town, despite the unease clawing at their minds. Every corner they turned seemed to hold another secret waiting for them. Windows seemed to glimmer with movement when no one was inside. Doors creaked open on their own, and echoes of voices drifted faintly through the mist. By midday, most of the men were jumpy, their nerves worn thin. The town wasn't just abandoned, it was alive in its own way, and it was watching them carefully. Still, the squad leader reminded them of their orders. They were there to uncover the truth, and the truth was hidden somewhere within those streets. What none of them knew yet was that the town's secrets were far darker than anything they had imagined. And before the night ended, they would come face to face with the terrifying reality of what had driven the people away. The second night in the Appalachian town settled over the squad heavier than the first. They had explored nearly every street by daylight, uncovered strange traces of the people who once lived there, and felt the town pressing in on them with every step. But as the sun sank behind the ridges and shadows stretched long across the broken streets, a familiar dread returned. The soldiers were trained to trust their instincts, and their instincts screamed at them now. This place wasn't just abandoned, it was waiting. They set up camp in what had once been the schoolhouse, its windows cracked and its walls decorated with faded children's drawings. The soldiers tried not to look at them too long. Some of the pictures seemed ordinary, smiling suns, stick-figure families, but others were unsettling, shapes with too many limbs, figures with black circles for eyes, and houses drawn with no doors. One soldier joked nervously that maybe the kids here had been a little strange. No one laughed. As darkness closed in, the squad tried to keep their spirits up. They lit a small lantern in the corner, careful not to make too much light, and shared canned rations. Conversation was minimal. Everyone had noticed the same thing during their daylight search. The town looked frozen, but it wasn't still. They'd all seen movement at the edges of their vision, quick shapes slipping out of sight before they could focus. No one admitted it directly, but the tension hung over them like smoke. Around midnight, the unease grew sharper. It began with sounds again, faint at first. Scraping, tapping, a whisper of something brushing against the outside walls. The soldiers snapped to attention, weapons in hand, eyes darting toward the windows. The tapping moved from one side of the building to another, deliberate, like someone circling them. Then came the voices. Not loud, not clear, but carried on the wind through the cracks in the windows. It wasn't just one voice, there were several, overlapping in whispers too soft to understand. Some sounded like children, others like low murmurs from grown men. The effect was chilling. One of the soldiers, a tough man who had served in several war zones, pressed his hands against his ears and muttered, "This isn't real, it's just the wind." Just the wind. But his shaking hands betrayed him. The squad leader ordered the lantern extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. The men sat silently in the cold, listening as the whispers grew louder. They seemed to crawl inside the building, filling every corner, slipping under the doors and through the cracks. For a brief moment, one soldier swore he heard his own name being called in a child's voice. He gripped his rifle tighter, sweat dripping down his face despite the cold. Then, footsteps again, this time much clearer than the night before. They echoed in the school's hallways, slow and steady, as if someone was walking right toward them. The squad prepared for a confrontation, rifles raised, eyes straining in the dark. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the classroom door. The silence that followed was unbearable. Every man held his breath, waiting for the door to creak open, but it never did. Instead, the sound of giggling, high-pitched, childlike drifted through the cracks. It echoed across the classroom, bouncing off the walls. One of the soldiers cursed under his breath, his voice trembling, "Kids don't live here anymore." Before anyone could respond, the giggling stopped. The squad leader, forcing himself to stay calm, gave hand signals to two soldiers to check the hallway. They opened the door slowly, flashlights aimed into the corridor. At first, the beam revealed only dust and peeling paint. Then, halfway down the hallway, the light caught something. A small handprint smeared on the wall, fresh, as though pressed into the dust only moments ago. It was the size of a child's hand, but it was twisted, with too many long fingers. The soldiers stumbled back, slamming the door shut. Panic rippled through the squad. They had all signed up for danger, but this was beyond what any of them had imagined. The leader tried to keep order, reminding them of discipline and focus, but even his voice was strained. The rules of combat didn't apply here. You couldn't fight whispers, you couldn't shoot at shadows. Just before dawn, the soldiers finally dared to open the doors again. The whispers had stopped, and the footsteps were gone. They stepped into the cold gray mist of morning, exhausted but alive. But what they found outside only deepened the mystery. Across the schoolyard, the ground was covered in small footprints, dozens of them, circling the building in chaotic patterns. Some were child-sized, others larger, but all of them were strange, too narrow, too long, with toes that curved unnaturally. They weren't tracks made by any normal human. One soldier bent down to examine them and froze. The footprints weren't pressed into the mud. They were slightly raised, as if whatever had made them hadn't pressed down on the earth, but instead distorted it upward. He backed away, shaking his head. "This isn't right," he muttered. The squad leader ordered them to keep moving, to continue their search for answers, but everyone knew now that the situation had shifted. They weren't dealing with the past anymore. Something was here with them, alive in the present, circling them like prey. The town was no longer just a mystery frozen in time. It was active, aware, and playing with them. The soldiers had survived another night, but none of them believed the strange encounters were over. They had only begun to scratch the surface of what haunted those streets, and each man carried the heavy knowledge that the deeper they went, the more dangerous it would become. By the time the sun rose higher, casting pale light across the ruined town, the squad moved like men walking through a nightmare. Their rifles were steady, but their eyes betrayed them, darting constantly to the shadows, searching for shapes that vanished before they could be seen. Something was hunting them, and they all knew it. The fourth night arrived with a heavy weight pressing down on the soldiers. They had endured the voices, the footsteps, and the strange tracks. But now every man knew that it was only a matter of time before they came face to face with whatever haunted this forgotten town. Fear had become a constant companion. Even in daylight, the squad moved cautiously, rifles always raised, eyes darting to every shadow. The mist never lifted, and the silence felt unnatural, like the town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That evening, the squad set up a new base inside the old church. Its tall, broken steeple rose above the rooftops, a dark silhouette against the cloudy sky. The stained glass windows were cracked, the pews covered in dust, and a musty smell filled the air. Yet the soldiers chose it because it gave them a wide view of the town square and the nearby streets. If anything approached, they wanted to see it coming. As the sun sank, a strange hum began to vibrate in the air. It was so low it was almost impossible to hear, but the soldiers felt it in their bones, a dull thrum that rattled their teeth. Radios hissed with static, even when turned off. One man swore he could feel the floor beneath him pulsing, like the earth itself had a heartbeat. The squad leader kept his men steady, but his hand never left the grip of his rifle. When darkness fell completely, the noises returned. Not whispers this time, not footsteps, but something else, something worse. Scratching. It came from the outside walls of the church, long nails dragging across stone and wood. The sound circled the building slowly, scraping one wall, then the next, like claws marking their territory. The men aimed their rifles at the doors and windows, every muscle tense. The scratching stopped suddenly, replaced by silence, so deep it made their ears ring. Then came a sound none of them would ever forget: laughter. It wasn't human. It was high-pitched, broken, echoing like it came from many throats at once. It seeped into the church, surrounding them, filling their chests with ice. Before they could react, something slammed against the doors. The wood shuddered under the force, dust falling from the ceiling beams. Another slam followed, harder this time. The men backed away, weapons ready, eyes wide. The old church groaned under the pressure, as if something enormous was trying to break its way inside. Then, without warning, one of the stained glass windows shattered. A dark shape darted through, moving so fast it was only a blur. It landed on the far side of the church, crouched low, watching them. The soldiers swung their rifles toward it, flashlights snapping on. The beams revealed a figure that made their blood run cold. It was small, barely the size of a child, but its limbs were long and twisted, its fingers ending in sharp points that scratched at the floor. Its skin was gray and stretched tight over its bones, its mouth too wide, filled with jagged teeth. But its eyes were the worst, glowing, lidless, reflecting the flashlight beams with an unnatural shine. The thing hissed at them, and for a moment the soldiers were frozen in disbelief. Then more of them appeared. Shapes darted across the broken windows, climbing the walls like insects, their glowing eyes peering in. The laughter returned, echoing from every direction. The soldiers opened fire, the church exploding with the sound of gunfire. Bullets tore through the walls, shattered wood, splintered pews. Some of the creatures fell, but when the men blinked, their bodies were gone, vanishing into the mist as if they'd never been there. One soldier swore he saw one crawl across the ceiling, its limbs bending backward in impossible ways. Another man screamed as something clawed at his leg from beneath the pews. They dragged him back before the thing could pull him under, firing into the dark until the sound of claws scraping against wood faded. The fight seemed endless. Shadows darted in and out of the building, never staying still long enough to get a clear shot. The creatures laughed and hissed, their voices echoing in strange patterns that disoriented the men. At one point, the lights flickered out completely, and the squad was plunged into pure darkness, surrounded by glowing eyes. For a few seconds, the men thought it was the end. But then, just as suddenly as it began, the chaos stopped. The creatures retreated into the night, their laughter fading into the distance. The church was left in ruins, windows shattered, walls scarred with deep claw marks. The soldiers stood in silence, breathing heavily, their weapons still raised, waiting for another attack. but none came. When the squad leader finally called for a ceasefire, the men lowered their rifles with trembling hands. The church smelled of gunpowder and dust, their ears still ringing from the roar of gunfire. One soldier whispered shakily, "What the hell were those things?" No one had an answer. In the pale light of dawn, the squad inspected the damage. The claw marks on the walls were real, deep gouges carved into the stone. Blood, thick, black and sticky, stained parts of the floor. But there were no bodies. No sign of the creatures themselves, as if they had never existed. The squad leader tried to make sense of it, writing down everything they had witnessed, but the truth was clear to everyone. These weren't ghosts, not in the way the locals had described. These were something else, something far older and far more dangerous. And now that the soldiers had faced them, they knew the creatures weren't just shadows in the mist, they were predators. The men had survived, but the encounter left them shaken to their core. The town wasn't just haunted, it was infested, crawling with things that didn't belong in the world of men. And worst of all, the soldiers realized the creatures weren't simply defending the town, they were toying with them, testing them, waiting for the right moment to strike again. As they left the ruined church behind, none of the men spoke. The silence was heavier than ever, because now they understood the truth. The real horror of Appalachia wasn't the whispers or the shadows. It was the things that lived in the dark, watching, waiting, hunting. And they weren't set done yet. The soldiers hardly slept after the attack in the church. Every sound in the dark made them jump. Even in the first gray light of dawn, their nerves were on edge, and their eyes darted constantly to the shadows. They had faced enemies before, but never like this. These weren't men they could outfight, or ghosts they could ignore. These things were real enough to leave claw marks in stone, but unreal enough to vanish when killed. No matter how much training they had, none of it seemed useful now. By morning, the squad leader forced the men to regroup and continue the mission. They moved cautiously through the streets, their boots crunching on broken glass and gravel. Every window looked like an open eye, and every alley felt like a mouth waiting to swallow them. No one said much. They didn't need to. The haunted look in each soldier's eyes said enough. As they reached the far end of the town, something unusual caught their attention. It wasn't ruins or abandoned houses this time. In a clearing beyond the last row of homes, the earth had been scorched in a perfect circle. The soil was blackened, the grass completely gone, and in the middle of the circle, the ground was glassy, as though it had been burned by a heat far hotter than any fire. The soldiers exchanged uneasy looks. Nothing natural could do this. They searched the area carefully, rifles raised. No tracks led into or out of the circle. It was as though something had come down from above, hovered, and then left. One soldier, crouching at the edge, touched the burned soil and yanked his hand back quickly. It was still warm, as if whatever had caused it had been there recently. As they inspected the clearing, the radios began to crackle again. Static at first, then faint voices. But this time, the voices weren't whispers. They were urgent, clipped, almost like commands in another language. The men froze, their radios hissing with words none of them understood. Then, as suddenly as it began, the noise cut off, leaving silence behind. Night crept in faster than they expected. The mist thickened, swallowing the town in gray, and the squad retreated into one of the larger homes near the circle. It had once been a family house, with photos still hanging on the walls and furniture left behind. They barricaded the doors and windows, trying to make it as secure as possible, though each man knew deep down that wooden boards and nails wouldn't keep those creatures out. The soldiers tried to rest, but just after midnight, the ground began to tremble. Not violently, not like an earthquake, but with a steady, rhythmic vibration. They scrambled to their feet, weapons ready, as a faint hum filled the air. The same low sound they had felt in their bones the night before, only louder now. The windows glowed faintly, bathed in a light coming from outside. The squad leader signaled for everyone to stay low, and together they peered through the cracks in the boards. What they saw made their hearts pound. Above the scorched clearing floated a light. At first it seemed like a star, but it moved with a smoothness no aircraft could match. It wasn't a helicopter, and it made no sound except the deep, vibrating hum that filled the night. The The light pulsed, shifting from white to red to blue, casting eerie shadows across the town. It hovered silently over the burned circle, as if searching for something. One soldier whispered, "That ship's not ours." Another replied in a trembling voice, "Then whose is it?" The light began to descend slowly, and for a moment the soldiers thought it would land. But then shapes appeared at the edges of the clearing, those same twisted creatures they had fought in the church. Their glowing eyes reflected the strange light, and they moved in unison, circling the burned ground as though summoned. The soldiers' blood ran cold. The creatures weren't random horrors wandering the town. They were connected to whatever hovered above. The squad leader ordered silence, but one of the men panicked. He opened fire through the boarded windows, bullets tearing into the night. The sound shattered the quiet, and the light above responded instantly. It brightened, flaring like a sudden sunrise, and the hum grew louder, shaking the walls of the house. The creatures hissed, their movements becoming faster, more frantic, as though the gunfire had triggered them. The squad returned fire, windows splintering as bullets tore into the mist. But just like before, the creatures didn't fall like men. Some collapsed, only to vanish into nothing. Others darted forward, impossibly fast, scratching and clawing at the house. Boards splintered, claws scraped against wood, and windows shattered inward. Then came the beam. From the hovering light above, a shaft of pale blue energy shot down into the clearing. It lit up the night like daylight, bathing the creatures in its glow. To the soldiers' shock, the monsters froze. Their bodies stiffened, their glowing eyes locked upward. The beam held them in place, as though controlling them. The soldiers lowered their rifles slightly, confused, watching as the creatures were drawn toward the light like puppets on strings. One by one, the twisted figures rose into the air, pulled upward by the beam. Their screeches echoed through the night as they were lifted, their limbs thrashing wildly. The squad watched in disbelief as the creatures disappeared into the hovering craft above. The light pulsed once more, brighter than ever, then blinked out completely. The hum vanished, the night fell silent, and the mist rolled back in, as if nothing had happened. The soldiers stood in shock, their weapons still trembling in their hands. Not only had they seen the creatures up close, they had now seen the thing that commanded them, a craft in the sky, unlike anything they had ever known. Some whispered the word UFO. Others shook their heads, refusing to believe it. But deep down, they all knew what they had seen was not of this earth. When morning came, the scorched circle remained, darker and larger than before. The men stood around it in silence, each of them grappling with the reality that the town wasn't just haunted by strange beings. It was tied to something far beyond human understanding. The Appalachian woods didn't just hide legends and monsters. They hid a connection to something bigger, something watching from above. And now the soldiers realized they weren't just trapped in a cursed town. They were standing inside a hunting ground, where the prey wasn't just them, but humanity itself. The soldiers had no words for what they had witnessed. The craft had come and gone, taking the creatures with it, leaving only silence and a scorched ring in the ground. But silence didn't mean safety. Every man knew deep inside that this was far from over. They had seen too much, and whatever controlled those monsters wasn't finished with them. For the rest of the morning, they tried to regroup, but no one could concentrate. Some of the men argued that they needed to get out of the town immediately. Others said they had to report the event and gather more proof. Their leader was torn. If they left too soon, they might never understand what really happened here. But if they stayed, they risked being hunted again. By midday, they decided to search deeper into the town. The mist still clung to the streets, never lifting fully, even though the sun was high above. Moving cautiously, they advanced block by block, guns ready. Every door they passed was broken, every window empty, every house a hollow shell of what had once been a family's home. And then they found the bodies, not human remains, not exactly. In the basement of a collapsed store, they discovered several small skeletons scattered across the floor. They weren't animal, and they weren't like anything the soldiers had seen before. The bones were thin, fragile, the skulls too large for the size of the bodies. Some of the bones were fused in odd ways, as though whatever these things were, they weren't meant to live long. The men stared at them in silence. the air heavy with dread. One soldier whispered that maybe these were the remains of earlier creatures, ones that hadn't survived. Another muttered that maybe they were something else entirely, experiments or victims. Whatever they were, it chilled the squad to its core. They buried the bones quickly, each man silently hoping to bury the memory with them. But the town wouldn't let them forget. That night, the mist grew thicker than ever. It poured into the streets like a living thing, curling around buildings and swallowing the soldiers' path. Their flashlights barely cut through it. Even when they stood only a few feet apart, they could barely see each other's outlines. Every noise was magnified in the heavy fog. The drip of water, the creak of wood, the faint crunch of gravel beneath their boots. Then came the voices again. Not whispers this time, but louder, clearer, echoing through the mist. The soldiers spun around, rifles raised, but there was no one there. The voices sounded like commands, repeated over and over in a language no one recognized. The men tried to ignore them, tried to keep moving, but the voices followed them. It felt as if they were walking through the middle of a conversation that was never meant for human ears. Suddenly, gunfire erupted. One of the younger soldiers had opened fire blindly into the mist, swearing he saw a shape moving. The squad leader shouted for him to stop, but it was too late. The shots rang out, echoing across the empty town. And that's when the chaos began. The mist around them stirred violently, as though their bullets had woken something inside it. From the white fog, figures began to emerge. Not one, not two, but dozens. They weren't the same twisted creatures as before. These were taller, gaunt, their limbs too long, their faces pale and hollow. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their movements were unnatural, jerky, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. The soldiers opened fire, the night exploding with muzzle flashes. The figures staggered back but didn't fall. Some dissolved into the mist when hit, only to reappear behind them. Others seemed to soak up the bullets like sponges. The squad formed a circle, firing outward, trying to keep the things at bay, but the fog swallowed everything, turning the fight into madness. One soldier screamed as something yanked him into the mist. His cries cut off instantly. Another shouted that he saw shadows moving above them, crawling across rooftops like insects. The squad leader tried to keep control, barking orders, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of gunfire and the hiss of the mist. In the middle of the chaos, the hum returned. That same deep, bone-shaking vibration rolled through the streets. The soldiers froze for a split second, the sound cutting into their very chests. Then the light appeared again, this time not in the distance, but directly above them. A beam of white light split the fog, blinding them. The gaunt figures stopped moving and turned their glowing eyes toward the beam. Just like before, they stiffened, frozen, as though held by invisible chains. The light pulsed, and suddenly the creatures surged forward, not attacking, but hurting the soldiers. The squad tried to fight back, but the beam seemed to control the very air around them. Their bullets didn't fly straight, their voices felt muffled, and their bodies felt heavier with every passing second. The soldiers realized they weren't in a battle anymore. They were being pushed, funneled, forced into position. The creatures didn't want to kill them outright. They wanted them alive. The squad leader screamed for the men to fall back into a nearby building, and they scrambled inside, slamming the door behind them. But the house shook as if the very air was trying to rip it apart. Windows cracked, glass shattered inward, and the mist poured in like smoke. The beam outside grew brighter, searching for them. Inside the house, panic took over. Some soldiers prayed, others screamed, and one tried to smash his radio to stop the voices that were now blasting through it, louder than ever. The sound was unbearable, like hundreds of commands shouted all at once. The men clutched their ears, blood trickling from some of their noses. And then, as quickly as it began, the beam vanished. The hum cut off, the mist rolled back, and the soldiers were left in silence, shaking, gasping for breath, covered in sweat. They had survived again, but barely, and the truth was clear now. The town wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just cursed. It was a trap. Something far beyond their understanding was here, and it was hunting them, not to kill, but to capture. The squad leader looked at his men, his voice hoarse as he said the words no one wanted to hear. We stir not soldiers anymore. We stir prey. The hours after the attack dragged on like days. The squad had taken shelter in the broken house, but no one dared to sleep. Every man kept his weapon ready, staring at the windows and doors as if the mist would burst through at any second. The silence was worse than the noise. It was too heavy, too deliberate, as though the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to move. Some soldiers whispered that maybe they should run. Others argued that leaving would only expose them in the open. The squad leader said nothing at first, his face pale and exhausted. Finally, he told them what everyone already felt deep down. They're not letting us go. Not unless we figure out why we're here. At dawn, the mist thinned just enough for them to move. They left the house carefully, sticking close together, every step measured. The town looked even more broken in the daylight. The houses seemed twisted, like the wood had warped under some unnatural force. Power lines sagged low, their wires humming softly with a current that shouldn't have been there. Strange symbols had been burned into walls and sidewalks, shapes that made no sense but somehow felt alive, as if they were still glowing faintly beneath the grime. The soldiers moved toward the church at the center of town, hoping for cover, but also because something about it drew them. The bell tower rose above the mist, its shadow cutting across the empty streets. As they approached, the voices returned, not whispers, not shouts, but a steady rhythm, like chanting. It wasn't human speech, yet it had a pattern, a cadence that wormed its way into their minds. Inside the church, the air was colder. The pews were overturned, the altar smashed, and the floorboards covered in black stains that might once have been blood. In the center of the room stood a strange object, half buried in the ground. It was metallic, yet it looked alive, its surface pulsing faintly like it was breathing. Symbols crawled across it like shifting lights, the same ones burned into the walls outside. The men froze. One soldier muttered that it was some kind of machine. Another whispered that maybe it was a beacon, a signal to call the creatures. The squad leader stepped closer, but the moment he touched it with the barrel of his rifle, the chanting stopped. Silence fell so heavy it made their ears ring, and then the object reacted. The surface rippled, and a sudden wave of energy pulsed through the room. Every man staggered back, clutching his head. The radio on one soldier's belt switched on by itself, blasting static that turned into voices. But this time they weren't inhuman. They were human voices, pleading, crying, begging for help. Some sounded like children, others like women, some like soldiers. Names were called out, mixed with screams. It was as if the voices of every person who had ever vanished in the Appalachia region were trapped inside that machine. The soldiers backed away, terrified, but the machine didn't stop. The walls of the church began to bend inward, the wood groaning as though pulled by invisible hands. The mist outside pressed against the windows, trying to get in, and then, without warning, the metallic object split open like a flower. Inside was a dark pit, deeper than it had any right to be, glowing with a sickly green light. One of the younger soldiers screamed, swearing he saw faces in the light, hundreds of faces, pale and stretched, their mouths open in silent screams. Another swore he felt something pulling at him, urging him to step forward into the pit. It was magnetic, irresistible, like gravity itself had been rewritten. The squad leader shouted for everyone to fall back, but one soldier couldn't resist. He dropped his rifle and walked forward, his eyes empty, his body stiff. The others grabbed him, pulling him back with all their strength, but the pit fought against them, pulling harder and harder until, at the last moment, the squad leader fired a shot directly into the machine. The sound shattered the trance. The soldier collapsed, gasping, his eyes returning to normal. The machine screamed, not in sound, but in vibration. The whole church shook, dust and wood raining down from the ceiling. The pulsing light grew brighter, blinding them. Then the mist poured through the broken windows like a flood. Figures moved within it, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, their glowing eyes fixed on the squad. The soldiers fired wildly, retreating toward the door, but the creatures closed in. The church was collapsing around them, beams snapping, glass shattering. Just as the roof began to cave, the beam of light returned, brighter than ever. It cut through the mist, locking onto the machine and the floor. The object rose into the air, torn from the ground, twisting and writhing as though it were alive. The beam carried it upward into the sky, and with it, the creatures vanished. The soldiers stumbled out of the church, coughing, bruised but alive. They watched as the beam disappeared into the clouds, taking the machine and the horrors with it. For the first time since entering the town, the mist began to lift. The streets became visible again, the sun broke through, and the silence no longer felt heavy but empty, like the town had finally let go. But the relief didn't set last. The squad leader looked back at the ruined church, then at his men. "This wasn't set an accident," he said, his voice rough. "That thing was put here. It was meant to lure us just like it lured everyone before us, and whatever took it isn't set finished." The men didn't argue. They knew he was right. They had seen too much, heard too much. The faces in the light, the voices on the radio, the creatures in the mist. It all pointed to something bigger, something still out there. And now they were part of it. When they finally left the town, the sun was shining, but none of them felt warmth. Each man carried the weight of what he had seen, the fear that one day the mist would return, and with it the beam of light. The Appalachia wasn't haunted by ghosts, it was haunted by something far worse, something that could come back at any moment. And as they marched away, one soldier whispered what everyone else was thinking, but didn't dare say aloud. "We didn't survive this. We were just marked."